Hey everyone, it took a while to reach this point, but finally, going through God Eater games and Code Vein 1 to realize that Code Vein 2 is not connected, at least in the way I thought, had me like... what can I say? Some of you know how I choose and play my games, so yeah, you don't need to play previous entries. But somehow after finishing this game, it kinda confirms my feeling about the first Code Vein, specifically the moment you see a cocoon. However, the idea never gets developed. It is like, it may be important, but let's not talk about it or even point at it ever again. But we have to make it look like it is important. Shit. I have my theories, but I'll save you the chatter. In any case, as usual with these reviews, after finishing the game, let's dive into the story, gameplay, graphics, and music. Code Vein 2 begins explaining that in this time around, humanity almost vanished because of the resurgence, a phenomenon that turned humans into horrors. Time later, revenants appeared and fought desperately against this calamity, and while it was possible to contain it for a while, later some heroes pretty much sacrificed their lives to reseal it. Nonetheless, this doesn't fix the problem, because the way in which the resurgence was sealed consumes the life force of these heroes, and the moment they reach a critical state... 100 years later, Lou and the MC share hearts because the MC has already died once. However, this is not the end, because the resurgence seal is weakening, and a revenant hunter must save this world. Moments later, the task is explained in a clear way. These cocoons cannot be opened through conventional methods. The keys to open them are found in the past, and Lou is able to make time jumps. Unfortunately, her powers are not developed, so she needs to train and get a real grasp of these time jumps. This is where the journey begins, traveling to the past. Now, this story is going to be a constant back and forth between different times in the past and present. However, our choices can affect the present, so it is important to tread carefully. Along the way you will know multiple characters. For the most part, I will say that they are quite likable. There is also an Algótica or Draculona for those who are into that. Up to here I will say it is all good. There is a solid cast of characters and objective. Perhaps where it gets a bit is once considering the kind of world building the game offers, and to me it is almost the same as in the previous entry, where sure, you can find some characters here and there, but for the most part they feel kinda lifeless, like yeah, I was designed to be here and that's pretty much about it. Few are the ones who offer an interesting side story or something along those lines, so this is where things could have been managed in a better way. Aside from this detail, I believe it was a good story, but it doesn't solve all the issues. Of course, I won't spoil what I mean with this, but probably those things will be thrown into a DLC or something along those lines. Considering these details, to me the story is an 8.5. At the end of the day, it was quite enjoyable. The general development was rather interesting, and of course it is fair to mention that this game has multiple endings, but don't worry, you will not miss any of them, which is quite good. Gameplay-wise, the first moment I saw where this was pointing, it gave me this feeling.
Write that down, write that down!
Considering Elden Ring was released in 2022, to me it isn't that outrageous to think that Bandai Namco rushed like there is no tomorrow to deliver this game. And I'll explain things as we go, but before that, and continuing with my perception about the difficulty of this game, I will say it is a 5 chipotles out of 10. Personally, it was quite easy. Perhaps, just perhaps, the very last area is where things felt a bit more challenging, but aside from that, in all honesty, it was a normal experience. So Code Vein 2 pretty much committed the same scene as in the first entry with tutorials. Honestly, there's a point at the beginning where they pop as ads in a sketch page. In any case, this is an open world with RPG mechanics. The game gives you some basic pointers like, this is the general mission. These are some of the sub-quests you can tackle, and that's pretty much about it. So the world is quite big, but it doesn't take that long to traverse it. Especially because once you complete the first area, you get a motorcycle, and traversing from one point to another becomes quite easy. This doesn't mean you should take straight routes, because oftentimes you can find special skills, items, weapons, and things like that laying around. This becomes much more noticeable once you reach the Sunken City, because there are several buildings where you can find different things. Of course, the main places of interest are the dungeons. In general, they are not that long, however, they are on the okay side. My main problem with these places is that they didn't feel memorable at all. particularly because of how they were designed, oftentimes being but a straight path, with little to no deviations to enjoy the exploration, as well as the limited ideas that are presented. Sure, there are some that are slightly different, but I gotta say, at some point the open world felt like an excuse to throw a classic dungeon. Perhaps it was the general level of execution it had, because a straight path doesn't have to be forgettable. The deal is that throwing, building like structures every now and then without taking advantage of the environment feels like a wasted opportunity. Now, there are multiple ways in which you can customize your character, starting for the bloodline. Multiple allies along the way will give you something like a sample of their blood, most of them beginning with E or B rank, and from there, after beating enemies left and right, you will be able to upgrade the bloodline rank. There are some tasks in between, but for the most part that is how it works, and so each class gives you specific stats and possible skills. Just be careful and read what they do, cause you can start consuming your life because of some effects. Now, depending from your weapon and some of those stats, your character will avoid in a fast or clunky way, so take your time to check what you need to patch. That is where these slots come into play, giving you the chance to increase specific things, like strength, mind, and so on. You can also add different kinds of shields to parry. There are also these forma things which are like sub-weapons you can use. More will appear as you slay some specific enemies. Just don't forget that you need to buy the weapons, otherwise you will run through the game like me. As for the main one, here it works quite different from the first entry, because they have specific stats like handling, conductivity, etc. Each skill you assign to that weapon has a specific usage of these points, so just keep that in mind, as well as the kind of weapon you're using. In essence, all of them are different, despite being in the same group, so try to test things out. But you can also live with some of the first weapons you find. At the end, this entry follows a similar formula as in Dark Souls, being able to use pretty much whatever. And that's pretty much the customization. And this is where I start to complain a bit about this game, because while the idea at first was entertaining, later you have me going without shame or glory. And don't get me wrong, it is enjoyable to play something normal or easy from time to time, but when the character customization is this deep, for what is thrown at you down the line, it feels like there is no real need to think things around. Or at least, each time I fully leveled one of these bloodlines, you have me changing them like meh. The very ending is where it matters a bit more. Aside from that, to be honest, there was no real impact if you change things in between. Sure, some enemies deal much more damage, but the general difficulty definitely diminished a bit the experience. It would have been much more interesting if bosses were a bit more relentless, or the general world building forcing the player to think things through, like, okay, let's experiment with this bloodline, these skills, weapons, and so on. Otherwise, it feels like an overkill. And it is not just about leaving your partner behind. I roamed some areas without them, plus the forced dungeon, and I didn't feel that much difference. Yeah, your partner may work as bait, but the general strategy was pretty much the same. As for the general world, I know plenty of people didn't like this game because it feels like it is looking after Elden Ring, but I don't know, I haven't played the game and I don't tend to play that many open worlds, so it was an enjoyable journey for me. At least, it didn't feel like other games where they fill the whole map with little stickers left and right, so I would give the gameplay an 8. In the graphics section, I check glitches, aesthetics, creativity, and other visual things. Fortunately, it never crashed, but for some reason I lost the audio once. While the world around had sound effects, there were no sounds from my main character, so I had to close the game and start it once again. And yeah, it is quite ironic that I talk about optimization issues and you have me looking at numerous scenes with problems, giving it a cheap look, which once again is unfortunate, cause I believe the general idea is quite interesting. I won't deny that the base character design feels a bit off, like for some reason stretching their necks and making really big characters out of proportions felt weird. For some reason this reminded me to that panel from Burrito, you know, that thing about modern ninjas. This dude looked weird as shit, or at least that was the first thing that came to my mind. Another thing to point out is the general lack of enemy design. There are few that are quite original, but they get reused way too many times. Some of you may remember my complaint about the enemy design in the first Code Vein. Well, here it didn't feel as cheap, at least in regard in something like fan service, but the constant reuse of enemies didn't sit that well. At first I was looking at this like, okay, it looks from God Eater games, like a bit grotesque and weird, which is nice. But once I saw it again and again and again, it was like, ah no dude, for these kinds of games you cannot really do that. It drastically diminished the experience, because unique enemies are counted. Aside from this, I like that you can see how the world is connected, even when moving around in high places. Sometimes that was my way to find certain routes, like, okay, this trail leads you there and there. This is particularly useful in Corroded Scar, mainly because there are multiple layers where sometimes you see the target blaze on top, but the way to reach it is by moving through caves. Now, if I have to point the areas I like the most, it would be the Sunken City and the Forest, particularly because of the setting they presented. The Sunken City at first feels quite sad, looking at the contaminated water and that you cannot really see the edge of some platforms. Probably this effect was enhanced because for the most part the game ran through the night cycle multiple times, so there was an interesting contrast. As for the Forest, I enjoy the spirit light effect it was given, like something ominous is around the corner, with abandoned buildings and stuff like that. In a certain way dreamlike, at least because of how some story events get developed. The graphics section gets a 7. While it is true that I liked multiple executions, I cannot let pass the multiple hiccups with textures and lack of mobs. And to close the review, the music. Goshina is once again the main composer. In these past reviews I have talked about the different combinations he has thrown around, and between Code Vein 1 to this, they are rather similar. In general there is no music around the dungeons. Maybe what feels a bit hollow is that there is a faint tune that loops every now and then, but after a while it just passes to the background and it feels like, okay, it is there, but you don't really care about it. Then again, the tracks start to play once you find an enemy. What's cool is that each area has a distinctive tune. The bass of the track is rather similar to the one presented in Code Vein, with something like frantic percussion while there are some air or string instruments around. At least that is something I enjoy a bit more in this case, cause you won't listen to the same track countless times. And don't get me wrong, I like the first game OST, but this one feels a bit better on this end. Where it loses its charm is considering the general length of the game. That is where maybe, just maybe, it would have been better to have another kind of setting. Otherwise it feels kinda hollow. And something I definitely have to point out is that I liked how this remix from God Eater games was thrown in between. Probably some of you will recognize this track. What made this moment much better is how silly the following scene is presented.
Don't say a word. Don't even look at me.
In any case, to me the soundtrack is an 8.5. And with this, Code Vein 2 final score is an 8. It was a good game, but once again, this comment comes from someone who doesn't play that many open worlds, so it was refreshing to get out of my usual games. Nonetheless, things here could have been way better. The main problem is that there were multiple hiccups left and right, with some short visions regarding dungeons and lack of mobs to immerse the player much more into this world. But as another easy Souls-like game to play, sure, I recommend it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.